And I was woken up at about 5 to 1, and it was as if the wall in my bedroom had developed into like an oil pipe, and sort of as if it kind of dissolved and became an oil pipe. And out of this oil pipe gushed horrible black burning oil over me, burnt me both physically and spiritually.
Welcome to Catholic Talk. I am joined today by Dr. Gavin Ashenden, who I have had on before, and I have invited on again because last time we were talking more about his conversion from Anglicanism to Catholicism and that whole journey and how it went. And during that discussion, Dr. Ashenden told me a couple of very interesting things that happened to him along the way that I really wanted to get into more detail about. And one of those things was a near-death experience. So Dr. Gavin Ashenden, first of all, welcome to Catholic Talk. Sorry, before I begin, I should just say Dr. Gavin Ashenden, a former Anglican bishop, a former Anglican chaplain to the Queen. He's appeared on numerous programs, giving interviews on GB News, on Fox News, on EWTN. He currently writes for the Catholic Herald, I believe, and he's done many other things and does many other things. I'll put a link to his website and to his YouTube channel in the description. But yes, on to the topic. So I want to talk about some things that happened to you, Dr. Ashenden. One of those was a near-death experience. If you could just give me and give the viewers as much detail as you can, sort of when it happened, what kind of age were you, what kind of mindset were you in at the time, what were your beliefs at the time, what caused this to happen, that you almost died, and then what actually happened during the experience itself?
Right. Well, so can I begin with an introduction and refer to a guy called Sir Alister Hardy? And the reason for that is that he was a biologist who actually held the same chair as Richard Dawkins at Oxford. And the reason I want to begin with him is because he too had a series of very strange experiences and during the First World War. And one of the things he did after the First World War, when he was sent on a research trip to Antarctica, was he left a message behind in the Oxford Evening Press, I think, saying, if you've had any weird experiences, please send them on a postcard to this PO box. And he reckoned when he was back 3 years later after his Antarctic research trip, he would see what was there. In fact, despite the fact that already by the end of the 19th century, Freud and Darwin had quite a serious impact on popular belief, as well as, of course, the devastating effect of the First World War, where people felt that God hadn't delivered them from their own stupidities. The response was extraordinary, and they were so extraordinary he had to pay quite a lot of money to have them archived. And so he then he went through the responses and set up something called the Alister Hardy Religious Research Unit. Now, still, when I was doing some psychological postgraduate research in the 1980s, this was really not at all well known. But the reason for mentioning it is that behind our reticence to talk about spiritual experiences in secular culture, a great deal of this stuff happens, and near-death experiences become quite popular. People have written books about them, looking for different explanations. The secular explanation is that what one's experiencing one's own brain's electronics. All the dark tunnels and the lights are a way of understanding, a way of experiencing one's own neurological electricity in the brain. Now, people will have to decide what they think about that. I guess most of our listeners won't want to swallow a reductionist approach like that entirely. Apart from anything else, there are too many other details which make that single explanation problematic. In my case, I had been brought up as a Christian. I had half got Christianity and half not got it. I'd left school, high school. My high school happened to be a rather privileged one, built around Canterbury Cathedral. The cathedral itself had a great effect on me growing up. And as a teenager, I decided I would spend 1 year a Christian and the other year an atheist. The main reason for spending the other year as an atheist was I didn't have to live any kind of moral life. I didn't have to share my bootleg alcohol and other things. And I still think, actually, that one of the reasons why atheism is so appealing to the Dawkins and intellectual class is because it lets them off the hook in terms of all moral accountability. One makes up one's own ethics and isn't accountable. So I went out to Canada for 9 months, sort of a year abroad, and I did the normal things that people do. I worked as a waiter, and then I joined a government music program as a flautist and flute teacher, performing and teaching to kids in the inner city. At the end of this, we all went on a break into Northern Ontario for a music camp. It was fine. I was due to go back to England. And there was an incident that took place because our boss withheld our money from us. And the other teachers were all conservatoire members. They were really quite competent musicians who needed the money to pay their fees. So since I was going to train as a lawyer, they said, you know, you're the most articulate and perhaps the most pugnacious. Would you go and get our money from the boss? He's not paying us. So the boss and I had a confrontation. And to my great surprise, I found myself resorting to violence. I lifted him up by his lapels. He was smaller than me, and I shook him until he agreed to pay the money. So he did agree to pay the money. So job done. That was good. My friends were all very grateful. But the violence had a very bad effect on me. It really disturbed me, almost sort of undoing a screw somewhere in my inner psyche. And we were going to have a party that night, and I brought a liter of vodka to throw in to the party, and I went to my room and I drank it. And you can't drink a liter of vodka and not have your respiratory system unaffected. In fact, in later life as a university chaplain, I buried a number of students who'd drunk themselves to death on much less than that. And what I thought happened was that I saw myself leaving my body. This was about midnight. And I went to a bright light. Well, this is all quite conventional if you read the literature. Lots of people have this experience. But there were some strange things about it. So, for example, it wasn't light. It was what light was generated by. I knew somehow that this was the source of all light. It wasn't light itself. And I was in the presence of the divinity, I thought. And the divinity was both singular and plural. And although I formally knew about the definition of the Trinity, I wasn't conscious of having any kind of categorical departments in my mind to constrain my thinking. And I also knew that I had come to judgment. And I had a picture of myself. And it was like one of those old-fashioned black and white Hollywood films where there's a telephone switchboard. And busy telephone operators are putting the right cable into the right hole. And I looked at as if I was a telephone switchboard, and all my cables were knotted up and they were in the wrong holes. The thing was a complete and unworkable jumble, which was a strange image to have. And then something happened. Again, it was quite odd. A verse from the book of Revelation came into my mind. I'm sorry it was the book of Revelation. It makes it sound very apocalyptic, but it was. And it was the verse just before St. Michael fights the demons. There was silence in heaven for half an hour. And heaven, the court of heaven withdrew. I didn't actually, there were no visual images at all. It was impressionistic in some kind of very odd way, as if one could see, but not with the eyes. And therefore one couldn't describe anything visually. And then I remember thinking, I wonder if I'm going to be sent to hell. If I get sent to hell, I will at least have the consolation of knowing that there is justice in the universe, which again was a very strange thing, a piece of moral philosophy I didn't know I was capable of, and a strange thing to find oneself thinking. The court came back and I was forgiven and sent back, and very quickly discovered I was back in my body on the floor. And it was about 5:30 in the morning. It was dawn in September in Northern Ontario. And the really strange thing was I felt remarkably well. So if I have 3 or 4 pints of beer, which hardly ever happens nowadays, but I don't tolerate alcohol at all well. It makes me ill for days. And frankly, it seems to me to be biologically and chemically impossible that I should have drunk that spirit and been at all well. But I was not just well physically, I was well psychologically and spiritually. But I was so well that I thought, I've got to keep this sense of being forgiven is amazing. How can I keep it? And then in a rather kind of teenage way, I thought, well, okay, I've got to share it. It's got to overflow from me. So where does it go? Well, it's better start with the guy I beat up last night. So I waited until breakfast and then went to look for him. And then it became like a Laurel and Hardy film, I'm sorry to say. So he came out of a doorway of a hut and his name was Ricardo. And I said, Ricardo, come here, I want to talk to you. And he saw me, and having had a hard time at my hands the night before, he walked away. Oh, who wouldn't walk away? So I then sped up behind him to catch him. And he then started running and I ran after him. I shouted, come here, I want to forgive you, sounding increasingly aggressive. I finally caught him, found myself grabbing him by the lapels and starting to shake him, saying, look, I've come to forgive you. It was just ludicrous. I'm really sorry it was so stupid, but it was utterly odd. He didn't experience my running after him as an act of someone wanting to forgive him. And then something very strange happened. The following night, this ought to have been the beginning of a religious awakening. But the following night, a colleague I'd fancied, offered to become my girlfriend. And from that moment onwards, that her company and her presence and the delight of having a girlfriend wiped out the whole God thing. I mean, completely overshadowed and obscured it in a way that I'm quite ashamed of now. But it did. And indeed, my conversion came when she turned out to be not very, as you might think anyone who wanted to be my girlfriend, she turned out to be mentally not very well. And in fact, a year or two later, she became quite suicidal. Not from our relationship. I hesitate. I mean, I quickly want to say, but the reason I mention it was because I wanted to find a way of helping her, and I thought, in a rather primitive, again, post-teenage way, what happened the last time I faced a terrible crisis? Oh yes, God. Well, goodness me, why have I forgotten God? So I announced that I was going to go looking for God. And indeed, I went the next Sunday, I went to the local parish church in England. And as it happened, 3 days later, there was a university mission starting. I went to university mission and I had a provisional conversion. The man was talking about Jesus. And I finally heard about him properly. So he was described as the light of the world. And I thought, well, I know God is light. If Jesus is light, then he could be God. And he was the judge of all the world. I said, well, I know about judgment. Judgment's real enough. Perhaps Jesus is the judge and he's the savior and gives forgiveness. Well, I know about forgiveness. So there was a kind of identikit matching up of Jesus and this encounter with the divine. And well, he bears all the hallmarks and the characteristics. It's entirely possible. So I was studying law, so I was a bit skeptical and taught to be skeptical. So I thought, well, I will convert for 48 periods of 48 hours at a time on the balance of probabilities. It's not proved beyond reasonable doubt. It wouldn't pass the burden of proof for a criminal trial, but for a civil trial, Jesus might be the Messiah. So on the balance of probabilities, I became a Christian, and then decided I would review it every 48 hours. And I did, and I've kept going ever since because it's proved to be true. So that was how that event happened. I have to say, I didn't expect anyone to take these experiences seriously. I too had been sufficiently touched by the shadow of Freud to imagine that people would think I was mad or had had a breakdown or was an unreliable reporter. So certainly in the 1970s and 80s, people were more reluctant to take this kind of thing seriously. But perhaps one of the good things that's happened in the last few decades is that these kind of experiences have been seen to be much more common.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, personally, I think that the explanation the kind of secular world tries to give isn't satisfactory either. It is a very common thing. So one thing they don't do anymore is try to say that, oh, this probably didn't happen because so many people from around the world have had an experience like this. And there are some people who almost try to corroborate experiences. And, you know, when someone talks about, because there have been people who have said that when they've been out of their body, when they've had that experience, they've actually been able to say certain things that were going on. I mean, one lady even mentioned that she was above the hospital roof and she said what she saw on the hospital roof, and then they checked it and said, that's there. So how could she have known? But just back to your experience, that moment of judgment and forgiveness, what was that like? How did you know you were being judged, and how did the forgiveness look?
Well, this is where it becomes irrational. It's a bit like saying that one could see things but one couldn't see them. I mean, it's simply an existential experience of profound authenticity. I mean, bigger than the conscience. You know, St. Paul talks about, even if my conscience doesn't excuse me, God does. You simply know. I mean, it becomes the truest thing you've ever experienced, truer than anything else. So it just happens to you. I think just to add to your further point, William James is very good about this too. So he was an agnostic and the first professor of psychology and philosophy at Harvard, and he wrote this very good book called The Varieties of Religious Experience. As an agnostic, what he said is that the test we ought to impose on people's experiences is whether they change their ethical behavior. And I think we ought to acknowledge that people's experiences stretch across a very broad spectrum, starting with the neurological and the physiological and the mentally disturbed at one end, and moving through to the imaginative and through evil too. One of the things that evil does is it parodies good. And so there are plenty of experiences whose origins are evil and misleading. And again, the danger is that if you say, I've had this extraordinary metaphysical experience, one of the things you ought to do is to say, well, where does it come from? So in the monastic tradition, for example, it would be quite normal for an abbot to say to a monk who comes saying, look, like Samuel, I've heard the Lord speaking to me in the night. Well, calm down. It's almost certainly a satanic trick to puff you up with pride, to disrupt the community. Let's assume that it's deceptive. And I think from a Christian point of view, that's the right place to start. I think one should assume it's deceptive. And then only as it bears good fruit, or it seems to pass a number of tests, it's non-disruptive, it's non-egotistical, it has the capacity to transform appetite, behavior, constraints, egotism, and so on. Then one might slowly and reluctantly say that it's of God. So I don't want to say, I know this happened, I met God, but I do have to say, I believe this happened. And one of the most important aspects of it was that it acted as a catalyst for my own encounter with Jesus later on. And so for those reasons, I think it was certainly not just neurological, but in terms of its spiritual authenticity, I think it looked, I'd allow it to pass the test, but carefully and reluctantly.
Yes, there was something you said that I thought was interesting, because I watched another priest saying something similar. It was when you said, oh, if there's a judgment, in a way that's good. It shows at least there's fair judgment, even though you had this feeling of, well, maybe you'll be sent to hell. And there's a priest who he died, unfortunately, a few years ago, but he was, his name was Stephen Shire, Father Stephen Shire. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he had a similar judgment experience. And in his one, he actually had Christ naming his sins and telling him his sentence was hell. And then as that was happening, he was thinking, yes, that's what I deserve. And that's something you almost don't expect if you're going to be sent to hell. But it's almost like he was in the presence of something that he knew was so pure and fair and loving that this was his fair sentence. And unfortunately for him, Mary stepped in and actually allowed him to have another chance. But it was just that you always, well, I certainly always have had this feeling that if you're going to be judged to hell, you're going to argue and say, no, hold on a second, no, but I didn't mean to do this, or this wasn't my fault. Whereas he was saying, yes, this is all true. I deserve this. And And from what you're saying, it sounds like you were thinking, whatever the judgment is, at least you're going to be judged and there is a judgment.
Well, it's remarkably similar. I'm glad you said that because I would echo it exactly. I thought I deserved to be. I thought it was quite probable I deserved to be sent to hell. I didn't have the same experience of my sins being written out. Now, I was only 19. I hadn't had a chance to commit many mortal sins, if any. But nonetheless, one of the reasons why I've been a conservative Christian and traditionalist all my life, evangelical or Catholic, is because having experienced judgment, you know it's real. You know that there really is a satanic opposition, and you know that God is so holy and completely pure, and you know that there is no way you can stand in his presence by any kind of right apart from grace and forgiveness. I think I'd like to say something about Our Lady too, just in brackets, but because I've been thinking about it for a long time. One of the things I'm very aware of is the way that evil parodies and distorts and twists. And we've had a romantic and erotic culture driving us for the last 150 years, but much fueled by Hollywood. And I think that that my quest for love, for romantic and erotic and sexual love, was actually a misshapen quest for Mary. And the more I've got to know Our Lady, the more I've realized that the thing I loved in women that I was attracted to was a kind of Marian purity. And I'm beginning to think that that heavily over sexualized, over erotic, and over egotistical and narcissistic romanticism that we're in is in fact a very proud, a very serious distortion of our hunger for Our Lady. And this isn't my idea entirely. Dante thinks this too. So he encounters Beatrice, whom he falls in love with. It's a sort of, it's a stylized love. They've only met twice, but nonetheless. But Dante takes this, and he has Beatrice leading him towards the beatific vision, and also to encounter with Our Lady. And I think at the root of everything, we're in love with Our Lady. Obviously not in a sexual way, quite the opposite, but in a chaste way. But I suspect that so many of the misshapen longings that we have are met, first of all, in her. And so I just say that in response to your narrative of the other priest you mentioned who found her coming to his rescue at that critical moment.
Indeed, yeah. And what you just said there, I wish I could say that to many of my secular friends and they would just believe me. Because it's just misshapen. You don't understand. You love Mary. I wish that would help some of them. But you did mention the satanic as well in there. And I would like to move on to that. So that was your near-death experience. And you also had a couple of demonic experiences later on. I don't know if they were when you were, I think they were when you were an Anglican priest. Is that correct?
Well, the interesting thing about this, of course, is this requires the gift of discernment. I have to say that I became a charismatic quite early on because it was the charismatic movement that was renewing Anglicanism in the 1970s. Well, renewing a lot of the church. And I see the charismatic movement as a form of an infusion of lay mysticism into a highly secularized culture, to make something much to make experiences of God much more accessible in the face of the secular lid put on the sort of our spiritual pot. But putting it to one side, one of the things that so first of all, I had a couple of very dramatic experiences with the devil after my conversion, and I should have remembered them because I don't know, about 20 years in, I moved into a liberal phase. There were reasons for it. But again, it's quite astonishing how one can fool oneself intellectually by wanting a certain kind of life which requires you to forget or ignore or repress things that you know and should have kept faith with. So this sense of so first of all, I was very badly attacked by the devil on occasions when I was given my first opportunity to stand up and offer an evangelical witness to my conversion. And so I encountered him directly as a force of profound blackness and despair. I think the person who's got it best in secular literature is J.K. Rowling. Her Dementors are very, very close to the real thing. They come and they suck out all hope, love, light, and beauty. I don't know how she knows about the Dementors, but she's very close to it, to the real thing. However, of course, once again, we're dealing with a scale. And so although one can have a full scale satanic attack, the enemy attacks us all, and usually in ways that doesn't betray his presence. Lewis quite rightly says the one thing he doesn't want, one thing he'd like us to do is to not believe in him and not deal with him. And so I had a bad time with him explicitly at the beginning, and then he went quiet, or I didn't see him, or I ignored him. And for reasons I still don't quite understand, around about 2008, I had this sudden, terrible series of encounters with him, and there were numerous ones. The two in particular. The first one was I was at a chapel in Le Puy-en-Velay. I'd gone to Thésée for a week. I'd led a retreat there with some of my students, and I decided to take an extra week to think and to pray by myself, and went to Le Puy. I didn't realize that there had been early visitations of Our Lady at Le Puy. I didn't really know that it was one of the important beginnings for the route to Santiago de Compostela, but it turns out to be quite an importantly charged place. And then in the middle of it, there is a wonderful chapel on a kind of stalactite mound, St. Michael, from about the 8th century. It's quite a remarkable, looks like a sort of huge anthill, but about 100 feet high. And on the top of it is a very ancient chapel. And I was at a campsite below, and I wanted to go to mass there. So the first thing that happened was I was walking in the city, not far, and the architecture means that the eaves of the buildings overhang the pavement or the sidewalk. So they stick out about a couple of meters. And they shield you from the rain and from the sun a certain amount. And I was walking down the street, and a priest came towards me, and I thought, well, that's interesting. I'm always interested in other priests. I quite like looking into their eyes, see what the state of their soul is like, to pray for them. And he and I was dressed as a holidaymaker. We passed each other, and after we'd walked about 40 feet past each other, suddenly there was this enormous sound, and the whole of the roof above us collapsed, and tons of debris, concrete, masonry, plaster, stones, fell exactly in the gap between us. So if we 10 seconds later, and it would have killed us both, but as it happened, it fell just between us. We both stopped and turned around and looked back, and looked at each other over this devastation, and turned on our heels and gave thanks and walked on. But it was a very strange thing to happen, particularly as a couple of days later I met him again, and he was a celebrant. So we were walking up to the chapel and said hello to each other, but nothing particular. I was there again just as a holidaymaker. A mass started, and something very strange happened. It was like I'd had a stroke. Something went wrong with my body. Well, it wasn't my body. My body moved. It was with what I could hear and what I could see. As if I can't really describe it. I just thought, oh, I've had a stroke. This is terrible. But after it started, I had the sense that above me there was a vortex of dark birds or bats which were beginning to circle around my head and dive bomb me. But this is inside a building, so it can't be happening. So how is it possible that I could see or feel? I could see them really. It's like a plug, like a whirlpool, and they were. And as they dive bombed me, they brought fear and accusation and despair. In fact, they were so terrifying, I wanted to run out of the building, run out of the chapel. So, there are two bits of one's brain, well, several bits of one's brain, but one part is kind of a quiet video camera control room, which doesn't panic and says, well, this is interesting. I wonder what, so within the sort of video control room, the part of me said, well, this is fascinating. You should sit this one out. What's going to happen? This is theologically enormously interesting. Why are they? How is it possible that these dark, dangerous, and demonic things are allowed to disrupt a mass in the chapel dedicated to St. Michael with a perfectly good priest in the middle of a perfectly good Catholic mass, without any excuse? What on earth can be going on? And when will it stop? Don't run out. Wait until it stops. There's a theological lesson to be learned, came the voice in my quiet video control room. So steadying myself, I just sat there. Thought, well, so let's see. And then, the consecration took place, the epiclesis, the calling down the Holy Spirit, the elements. And I thought, well, surely that will see them off. Surely this is the moment. And then the elevation of the host, this should surely see, they should be frightened to go away. And they still kept bombarding me. And I thought, well, this is astonishing. And I went forward to receive the host, and the priest put it in my hands. And I thought, surely now. And then I raised the host to my tongue, and the moment it touched my tongue, it was almost someone had switched off a film or a reel or a light. Just complete normalcy was restored. I thought, well, that's extraordinary. I don't understand. I still don't think I understand. I mean, I understand the power of our Lord's body on the tongue, but it was a very strange thing. And then, not long away from that, I was at home in England, and I was woken up at about 5 to 1, and it was as if the wall in my bedroom had developed into like an oil pipe, and sort of as if it kind of dissolved and became an oil pipe. And out of this oil pipe gushed horrible black burning oil over me, burnt me both physically and spiritually. And I thought I was having a nightmare, obviously, but it was a waking nightmare. I was intensely disturbed, and it lasted about 4 hours, and then it stopped at precisely 5 to 5. And I've been awake all night, and in despair and anxiety, and I thought I must be having a nervous breakdown. I mean, I thought this could only happen because I've been working too hard and too long. And indeed, I was working both as a chaplain, as a senior lecturer, and researching and writing a book, and broadcaster, and I was at full stretch. I thought, well, I've overdone it. I'm going down the tubes. And I told my wife about it, and she agreed I'd been overworking and how stupid I was, and to overwork. Next night, I went to bed about 11:30, and at exactly the same time. So then what I did, sorry, I should say, I phoned up a friend of mine who was the Roman Catholic diocesan exorcist, a marvelous man called Father John Abberton, who died a couple of years ago. And I said, John, what's going on? It felt like an attack of evil, but I'm afraid I may just be going mad. And he listened and said, no, it's evil. You're going to have. I said, well, how do I deal with it? He said, well, only the Rosary, only Our Lady. And I said, well, I don't really, I believe in Our Lady theologically, and I haven't come to the point of praying the Rosary ever yet, and I'm not sure. And he said, well, he was a Yorkshireman. He said, well, he said, you can either love Our Lady or burn. He said, you choose. so I took a Rosary to bed and began to pray it, and it happened again the next night. 5 to 1, started at 5 to 1, ended at 5 to 5. So now I'd gone 2 nights without sleep, and I was very unwell and frightened. I had no idea what was going on. But the third night happened again. And I'd gone 3 nights without sleep now, and was also felt pretty brutalized, terrified. And in a way hoped it was a spiritual experience, because if it was a spiritual experience, I could come through it. But if it was a crashing nervous breakdown, I might end up in drugs for a number of years, and who knows, certified and what else. So, but it began to diminish as I continued to pray the Rosary. And so I suppose at some point in the middle of the night, I fell asleep. It was very quiet. And then my wife woke me up and said, something like, so I should explain that she has an unusually heightened sense of smell. It's so heightened that she can tell a gas leak when the gas board often can't. We've proved this on a number of occasions. And so one of the things we do in the spring is we close the bedroom windows because she can't sleep otherwise. And so she woke me up and said, you know, you're having such a difficult time. I'm surprised you'd want to provoke a domestic between us by not closing the windows. And I was very cross. I said, woman, I've just fallen asleep for the first time in 3 nights, and you're talking to me about windows. Leave me alone. Just, you know, get off my back. And she said, well, you know, it's very important, and I can't believe you'd be so selfish and irresponsible. And I said, the windows are closed. I closed the windows. Leave me alone. Let me sleep, for goodness sake. It's my first moment of sleep in 3 days. So she said, well, you know, it won't help you, not you adding you lying and not owning up to your mistakes. You know, that's not going to help you in these circumstances. I said, go and check the bloody windows. So she went and she came back, and there was silence. And I said, right, they're closed, right? Yes, she said, they're closed. I said, well, there's still a problem. You need to explain why the room is full of the smell of roses. In fact, the smell of roses is so overpowering it's woken me up. How is it possible? And I said, well, from the little I know about mystical theology, it means Our Lady's here. And my wife said, well, you've been clacking those beads for 3 nights. It's about time something happened. I'm sure Our Lady was there, and it went away, and it never happened again. And I don't know why it happened, but I can tell you that from that night onwards, I go to bed every night with a rosary in my hand. And one of the things that I've developed from that is a sense that actually the nighttime is a time of spiritual battle. I'm already, was I aware already, but I certainly have become since, that things happen in the night, and one has to enter it in prayer and emerge from it in prayer. And if one wakes, to treat it not as an oppression of sleeplessness. I had a very good Anglican spiritual director called Father Gregory from a contemplative monastery in Sussex. And one of the things he always used to say was, if you wake in the middle of the night, treat it as an invitation of the Holy Spirit to pray for the church. Don't complain. Don't just pray. And I think one of the things I do now is when I wake in the night, I simply start the rosary going again. I seldom get past a couple of decades before I'm asleep, and I rather think the devil would have me asleep than praying the rosary. So it's win-win either way. But since then, my sense that the night time is both theologically and metaphysically a dark time and requires entering with the rosary in hand has been seriously heightened.
You mentioned for one of those experiences you were in a chapel in France. Now, at the time you were Anglican.
Yes.
This was a Catholic chapel.
Yes.
Is that quite normal for Anglican priests to sort of celebrate Mass in Catholic churches?
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm embarrassed to say it is entirely. There is a conceit amongst Catholic-minded Anglicans that they're as Catholic as anybody else, and they're perfectly entitled to take Catholic Mass if they choose to. It's a sort of form of self-deception, and I'm afraid it's. I'm very critical of it now. A number of people have written, say, well, what were you doing accepting Mass as an Anglican? Who do you think you are? They're quite right. But I'm afraid there is a self-deception in Anglicanism, in Catholic Anglicanism, that says, well, we're Catholics. And so it's just, you know, there's just a hiccup of the fact that that our church doesn't accept the Pope, and we're governed by anti-Catholic 39 articles. It's a form of, to explain it properly, I think, St. John Henry Newman arrives and says, let us investigate the myth I say myth in a neutral sense, the myth of Anglican continuity. After all, we've inhabited the same buildings, and there's some arguments for our orders being tactilely intact. And so what Newman tried to do was, by reference to the fathers, was to assume that the link was sacramentally valid, and then call the Church of England back to its Catholic roots. But there were several problems. First of all, that he did it in an immensely ingenious way by examining particularly the overwriting in the 39 articles and saying that it's the adjectives that there's a problem with. But whilst this was a very intellectually clever way of doing it, the fact was the Church of England didn't want to be Catholic. And so those who were hungry for a Catholic sacramentalism divided into two groups. There was Newman, who said, well, in which case we have to become Catholic if we're sincere. And Pusey and others who said, no, we must persuade the Church of England to become, we will stay here enjoying, if you like, Anglican freedom from the Catholic discipline and persuade the Church of England to become Catholic. So over the last 100 years, the Catholic movement of the Church of England has said, well, we're with Pusey, we will slowly persuade them. And there was some evidence with the growing parish communion movement that they were making their way towards doing that. And the high point was probably when Archbishop Michael Ramsey was in charge, because he looked like a bishop. But as you know, when Pope Leo XIII examined it theologically, he said there is no continuity. First of all, the tactile links are not proven, they're in doubt, which is not helpful. But even if they were proven, your ordination liturgies show that you have no intention of consecrating a sacrificial priesthood or celebrating the sacrifice of the Mass. In fact, your liturgy specifically has a whole series of elements which contradict it. I mean, the words of reception are a mixture of Lutheran and Zwinglian. I mean, there's no way you could say this is hospitable to a celebration of the Mass. And so no, there is no, your orders are not valid. But part of the self-deception of Anglicanism is to ignore that and say, well, they might be, or they should be, or perhaps he was mistaken, or anyway. So I apologize. I was part of that self-deceptive culture and took Mass whenever I chose to.
Yeah, the reason I mentioned it was because I've heard that story before, and I remember thinking that at the time you were an Anglican, and when you mentioned the host touching the tongue, I thought, well, this couldn't have been in an Anglican church, could it? Because it might not have had the same effect.
Well, see, you're quite right. One of the first things that as I began to explore the implications of everything that was happening to me, first of all, there was the enormous impact of Our Lady's protection, which astonished me and began to make me completely change my theological landscape. But then I also looked at the Eucharistic miracles. So, I mean, I looked at Our Lady's apparitions and what they were for and what they were intended to do and what she was calling the church to do. And I looked too at the Eucharistic miracles. I thought, well, okay, let's see if there are any Anglican Eucharistic miracles. And there aren't any. At least, I mean, I haven't discovered any. I once saw some evidence of a photographic image that might have suggested something miraculous for a group of continuing Anglicans celebrating Mass who claim to have valid Catholic orders inherited from Catholic bishops who ordained Episcopalian bishops. But that was the only one I ever saw. And it may be true, it might not be true, but the answer is there's no evidence of it. And so one of the reasons for Anglicans becoming Catholics is it looks like we were shooting blanks, that our orders were not valid. The Mass, the body and the blood of our Lord did not come, and it's too important to fudge. The Eucharistic miracles are such a grace, and they're so prevalent within Catholicism, and so not prevalent elsewhere, that this ought to make people sit up and think. It made me sit up and think.
Indeed. You mentioned the wall falling down between you and the priest. Is that something that actually happened, or is that something you think might have been?
No. It was the roof. It was the eaves of the roof. No, it genuinely fell down. No, that was real. That was absolutely concrete, real. That was also a near-death experience. Another 15 feet back, and either of us would have been crushed to death. No, it was just an extraordinary thing to happen. I mean, looking back on it now, I would say this was a satanic attempt to rub out two priests. So perhaps he was a very holy man. Who knows? He may have been the future Archbishop of Paris, spending time in we have no idea. No, it genuinely happened. But again, as with all things, one starts by saying, well, okay, so this was just a bit of weak architectural infrastructure. Weren't you lucky? But then you begin to ask theological questions about the timing and the place and why, and it begins to look a little bit more suspicious. So I won't say it was a satanic attack, but it looks a bit suspicious to me.
Yeah, particularly when aligned with the other things that happened. And
yeah.
And okay, so my final question is, when you had because you had that experience in the room where the wall was opening up, and then the suggestion from the Catholic priest was to pray the Rosary.
Yes.
Did you start praying the Rosary from that time on, and then did you have no more experiences after that?
Oh, I have plenty of experiences. I had a particularly dreadful time yesterday. No, the enemy never stops. The enemy.
That's true. Yeah, I suppose. I mean, such prevalent
No.
ones, such obvious ones.
Yes. So I mean, these were sort of crossroads ones. But no, it's about discernment, isn't it? No, I rely. There's almost always a rosary in my pocket or to hand. I mean, you know, I'm just never far away. I remember, for example, I was translating for an African bishop who was Bishop Oliver from northern Nigeria. I was on a retreat in Rome, and I had seen about 6 months before on YouTube this African bishop say he was praying for the Blessed Sacrament in his diocese. Boko Haram had kidnapped all those Nigerian Christian girls, you may remember, a couple of hundred of them, and he was praying in front of the Blessed Sacrament one night, and our Lord appeared to him. And there's this most beautiful YouTube video. Look it up. It's called Bishop Oliver. If you put Bishop Oliver and Rosary in Nigeria, it will come. And he's talking to the diocese, and he says, I want you to know, dear people, that when our Lord appeared to me, it was nothing to do with my sanctity. I'm not a very good bishop. I'm just like you. But he, you know, he has a message for all of us. And this is what happened. Our Lord approached me carrying a sword, and I was very surprised. I'd never seen our Lord with a sword in his hand in my imagination or in literature or anywhere else. And then he gave it to me without any words, and I was very surprised. So I took it from him, and as I took it from him, it turned into a rosary. And then 3 times he said, Boko Haram is finished. And so I'm telling you, my beloved children, our Lord has come saying our weapon against Boko Haram is the rosary. And so I was translating with him. And halfway through, I suddenly, I had no idea. I was translating into French, I think. And he was, only halfway through did I realize this was the bishop of the YouTube video as the story began to unfold. And I thought, I know what's going to happen. He's going to put his hand into his pocket and dig out and say, you know, and our Lord, it turned into a. So I put my hand into my pocket to get my rosary out. At the critical moment, we both lifted our rosaries up. So now I don't go anywhere without a rosary. And I'm afraid the enemy is constantly attacking in one way or another. And it just so happens that it is perfectly clear to those who practice it that praying the rosary is the most powerful method. I mean, I remember thinking, I spent some time at a Greek Orthodox seminary when I was training, and I learned the Jesus prayer and became very fond of hesychastic spirituality. And I thought, well, how can it be that the rosary appears to be more powerful in moments of spiritual crisis than the Jesus prayer? Surely this is a miscategorization. But I think I heard 2 Catholics discussing this the other day, and one of them said, "Well, it's a bit like you know, if you're going out and you get into trouble on the street, and your wife comes to your rescue, and she who beats up the bad guys. You know, the bad guys are going to be deeply humiliated. It's your wife who beats them up." And the demons don't like the fact that, you know, they know about our Lord. They know that's part of the deal. They know what's going on, but they can't get over the blow to their pride that Our Lady, who was fully human, though without sin, reversed the success with Eve. It's a source of profound humiliation for evil, and I think that's partly where the power of their discomfiture arises from.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, they certainly hate Our Lady, and I have seen the story about the priest, the bishop, who saw Jesus during his prayer. And I always find it something very common that people who have these amazing experiences, they always have a very modest kind of look. This isn't because I'm special. I don't think that this has happened to me because I'm better than you. And he obviously said the same thing.
It's
very
very
comforting.
it's very beautiful, and of course, and it's one of the tests. If you have an experience, if you have an experience like this and it's genuine, it leaves you with such a sense of your own unworthiness. So if that sense is missing, then you're entitled to doubt the thing was real in the first place.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Ashenden, thank you very much for your time. I really do find your stories very interesting, the near-death experiences and the demonic experiences you've had. In a way, it's almost like they are terrifying experiences, but I almost feel like you're lucky to have had them as well, because most people don't have those kind of experiences, and it really does make you think a little bit more, a little differently. I mean, maybe, you were generally, when you were an Anglican priest, for example, you were sort of on the right path in some sense anyway. You weren't an atheist or anything, but it probably still did something to you.
I think we have to be a bit theological and talk about Heilsgeschichte, the story of our salvation. So all our lives are a story of salvation. We all have our Heilsgeschichte, the way in which the Lord has taken us from out of Egypt into the promised land, out of condemnation, proper condemnation, into forgiveness. And so I think one can only understand one's life looking backwards. Who was it? Wasn't Oscar Wilde? It was Kierkegaard, I think. Almost, yes, it was Kierkegaard who said that. Sorry to confuse Kierkegaard and Oscar Wilde. How stupid of me. But anyway, yeah, they both had some excellent one-liners. But as Kierkegaard who said that our tragedy, our difficulty is that we have to live life forwards, but we really only understand it looking backwards. So I think one of the great joys of being my age is that I suddenly get quite a lot of why what happened. I didn't know that I would retain an Orthodox faith into my late 60s at a time when Christendom was going to be under such enormous pressure. I think the coming 10 years are going to be really rather dreadful. And I suspect the church will have to go underground. We're going to go back to the catacombs. And the Lord's given us a responsibility of fighting what appears to be a cultural struggle, but it is of course a demonic struggle. I mean, I think the two very serious wounds in the world's spiritual life are abortion and pornography. They have caused such they've caused such damage to what would, if you like, be the natural protection, the imago Dei, that all human beings in the image of God might hope to have. And the leverage that evil has through these two dreadful phenomena is terribly serious. I mean, there has been no point in human history where abortion and pornography have been experienced on this scale in social affairs. And one has to see it as providing some form of metaphysical leverage. And therefore, if you like, I think one's entitled to say that we're in a very serious apocalyptic period where things are coming to a head. I mean, if only technologically speaking, the fact that everyone can experience all these things at the same time is itself a form of apocalypticism. And therefore, we're given the privilege of defending our Lord's body, his bride, at a time when matters are high, at their height. So I think I would say, looking at these things, that they are not, they weren't given to me for any, certainly not for any virtue at all. But their effect has been to give me a sense of clarity about what the church is being asked to do, and so I'm hopeful that what I'm doing is speaking out with a degree of persuasive clarity about what the Holy Spirit wants us, how he wants us to respond in a time of very serious crisis. I in a very strange way, I've always felt quite close to St. Augustine of Hippo, because he was born in 354 and I was born in 1954. So I thought, well, this is interesting. He died in 430, so perhaps I'll die in 2030. I can't expect to live much longer than him. I just had a sense of a slightly narcissistic sense of over-identification with him. But I was very struck by the fact that as he died, the Vandals were at the gates, literally. And I'm quite sure that as I die, the Vandals will be literally at the gates. So these next 10, 15 years are going to be very, very significant in the life of the church in the West. And I think I'm with Cardinal George of Chicago, who said in 2016 or so, I expect to die in my bed, my successor will die in jail, his successor will be martyred in the public square, and his successor will play a part in rebuilding society along Christian lines, as we always have done. So in fact, the present Archbishop of Chicago doesn't look like he's going to die in jail, but prophets can often be a generation or so out. But I think the trajectory is right, and so it's any experiences are given as a gift to heighten our sense of what God's calling us all to do as a church.
Indeed, yeah. Yeah, certainly things certainly don't seem to be heading in a good way at the moment. I think many Catholics would agree. Thank you very much, Dr. Ashenden, for those final wise words, and thank you for your time today. Generally, I really appreciated the talk, and I wish you a very good day.
Thank you for everything you're doing. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. And for those of you who've listened through to the end, God bless you. God keep you too.
Thank you very much. And God bless you too, Dr. Ashenden.